Hello and welcome. My name is Leah Kopke and I'm a 3D motion design freelancer. This is my 3D modeling podcast, Ambient 3D Animations. In the last episode, we went through all the settings for the Pyro emitter tag and the fuel tag inside of Cinema 4D. Today, we're going to be going into greater depth of the Pyro output, and it can do more than just cache your animation. So we're going to talk about the Upres option, as well as how to add noise to your simulation after you've cached it to make it look more detailed. So let's go ahead and do a rough overview of that, and then we'll jump into all the settings so that you feel more comfortable working with the Pyro output and rendering your work. So here you can see that I have this really detailed looking smoke, and it didn't actually start off that way. I used the Pyro output in order to add an extra noise to it, as well as subdivide the voxels. The word upres is what it's called. What that's doing is subdividing the voxels to get more detail. And that's how we got this really nice detailed smoke here in this example. I'm going to turn off the IPR here for a second. So this one is the upresed version. Over here I have the identical simulation, except this one doesn't have the upres added to it. You can already see the voxels a little bit more. Voxels are those little cubes we were talking about that make up your simulation's form. So you can see a lot more little voxels in here. And this one visually just looks smoother, and the voxels look smaller. They were subdivided using that upres option after we cached it. If I were to render out this one, it's going to update. It's updating. Here we go. You can see that this one is not quite as detailed. As this one. You can see a little bit of the difference. The smoke's a little bit finer with the upres version. This is the non-upres version. It doesn't have that noise added along it either. So there's quite a difference. So that helps you control the look you're trying to get. And we're going to talk about that today in greater depth. We're going to go through the Pyro output. We'll talk about all of these settings, what the on does versus on export versus off. We'll talk about mask velocity and the dual rest grid. So let's get to it. I'm going to open up a new scene. That was just an initial example so you know what we're talking about today. I'm going to drop a cube into our scene. I'll make it a little bit smaller. I'll make it 30 by 30 by 30. And we are going to need an emitter. So I'm going to right click on this, go down to our simulation tags, and I'm going to find the Pyro emitter tag. So with that added, we automatically get a Pyro output right over here, and that's what we're talking today is about, this Pyro output. If I start pressing play, we'll get a simulation. So this is our simulation here. It's going for about 90 frames. If I hit render, we won't see any fire. So we won't see any fire in here, in part because there is no material added to the Pyro output. So this is where you're going to add your volume materials. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the renderer here for a second. I'm going to click on this material manager icon, go into create materials, and you can use two different materials in here. You can use the Pyro volume, you could use the volume. we're going to use the Pyro volume for today. We'll go in greater depth of the material a little bit later, but we can use this pretty much set at default and drag and drop this onto our Pyro output and press Start IPR. Pretty quick you'll see your simulation running. So this is our fire. Now, if I look into here, you'll see that we have the density, temperature, and velocity on export. These other ones are turned off. So that means that we are able to, what the on export means is if you go into your material here and you want to connect it to the Pyro output, if you click on this presets here, you'll see Pyro output density, temperature, and velocity, because that's what we have set right now by default in the Pyro output. And that'll allow this to recognize it so that it renders. So we have the density channel under scatter. We have temperature under emission. So you can see that's controlling that there. And that's automatically set up for us when we use that Pyro volume, which is really nice. You can also set it up manually by selecting density in here if you wanted to. You'll notice that you can also put a color channel in here. So if you want to add more to this, like for instance the color channel, we're going to need to change this from being off to being on export. And once we do that, you'll be able to see this come up as an option in the output. And without doing that, we won't be able to see the color really here. So where this would go typically is in your color channel. So we'd want to go into our Pyro output and add in the color. And what that means is if we go into here and we turn on our color channel and we change it to something like green and refresh this. Going to also add in a redshift sky. And I need to start this simulation over again so that we get that green smoke. So now you can see we're getting that green smoke. We changed it part way, so that's why it wasn't showing up before. And now we see the green smoke because we have our color channel in here. So that's how you set that up. So you can imagine that with all of these options under object, that they need to be turned on in order to see those as options in there. That's how you see them. I'm going to turn everything off so that we can talk a little bit about that. And I'll start at the beginning. So even if you turn everything off, that doesn't mean that the simulation isn't happening. That just means that it isn't being saved to your RAM. So this is a really quick way to preview your animation and get an idea of what it looks like in your viewport. However, you won't really be able to see it if you hit Start IPR with this set off, because you need to have that RAM data in order to render it. You can see here that it's not rendering out when I have the Pyro output set to off. So if you want to see that fire as a render, one option is to use this on. So if we want to see the density, we need to turn this on. If we want to see the color, we'd need to turn this on, temperature on. We'd also, so those are actually the main ones that we would need. I'll turn on velocity. But that's basically what this is it just turns these on. You really only need to turn on the ones you're using. I'm turning them all on just because we're talking about it. I'm going to start this over here. And now you can see that if we hit render, it's going to render. So if we want these to be options for when we cache it, on isn't enough. This gives us a RAM preview, but if we want to export this out as a VDB, then in that case, we need to turn on export for these. So now we can actually export this out as a cache. So you set up what you want to export in this tab under Object, and then we'd go over to our Cache tab over here, and you'll see this option Cache or Cache Scene. So what you'd want to do is, first of all, you can set up your name where it says template file name, and this $PRJ, that means that it will automatically use your project name in the file. And then it says $frame, and that'll use the frame in order to determine where the name in here. So that'll be using that. If you want to adjust this or type in anything else, like example, you can. And then if you choose cache scene, it will cache everything that's a simulation in your scene, whether if it's a collider or under our simulation tags, it would simulate the rigid body, cloth, soft body, all of these options here, anything that's a simulation. It'll simulate that all together. If you choose cache scene, you can choose cache, and that would just cache the selected object. If you choose delete selected caches, it'll delete a cache, both from your hard drive and from here. So it's going to export these out as a VDB file type, and that'll save all the voxels and the information for that file so that you can play this back in real time. Because you can see if I move my mouse over here, this isn't really updating in real time. If I click anywhere along this timeline, you'd have to play from the start to the finish. But if you cache it out, that'll allow you to automatically have it be updated and be able to play forwards or backwards in any way. And it gives you more control over that. You can bring it into another scene without having to have it recalculate. It runs a little bit quicker because it's it's a file that is saved on your computer rather than having to do those calculations each time. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cache. And when we do that, it'll ask, do you want to store these files at the project location? You can press no and choose your own location. I'm going to quickly do that. I'm going to go ahead and save the file here, so I'll click select folder, and you can see that it is running the simulation and updating accordingly. It'll take a couple minutes, we're almost there. Okay. And then once that's done, you'll see this appear in your cache path. So you can see that this is where it's saved. And if somehow this file gets deleted or moved and Cinema 4D can't find it again anymore in the file, it'll turn red. So you can also drag and drop VDBs from a folder into here in order to populate this. You can have multiple versions of cached simulations in here, and whichever one is checked on will be the one that is being used. If you have enable turned on, it will be using the cached data instead of rerunning the simulation without that data. So if I press play, you can see this plays back really quick. I can go backwards, I can go forwards, I can click to some random point in here and it'll go directly there because this is cached. So it can play back really quickly, and this is good for when you finalize a simulation and you'd like to play it out. You'll see your volume information in here. It'll tell you your voxels and all the information for your color, density, divergence, fuel, pressure, temperature, velocity, whatever you had chosen in your object tab to have exported out. That data can be seen under your volume information. So you might find that helpful if you want to know how heavy the simulation is or just some data on it, especially if someone else was the one working on it and you're using it in your scene and you're working on a group project with someone. It's nice to be able to see that and know what the settings were. Once you have this cached, you actually no longer need this Pyro emitter turned on, because you can play this back and forth just from the Pyro output. You no longer need to have that turned on anymore. It'll actually run a little bit quicker if you have it turned off. So some other things to talk about is we wanted to talk about Upres Scene or Upres Active Cache. Upres Scene, that'll just apply the subdividing to the voxels to everything. And these are made up of little cubes, voxels, and that's the amount of detail you have in here. So it can be render intensive to render out smaller voxels. So sometimes it's easier to use this upres option than to actually run the calculation with that much detail. So this is your Upres factor, and that's how many times you are subdividing that voxel. So if these voxels are 1 inch and we're subdividing them one time, that would make them a 1/2 inch, and then if you subdivide them again, that would be a 1/4 inch. So that's what this factor is determining. How many times are we subdividing this? Additional octaves, this is the amount of detail added to that noise. We were talking about that in this other file here, about adding that extra layer of noise to have more detail in here. I rendered out an example of this, and I added a curve to it so you can really see in greater detail the noise. So this noise was added on top. And I tried to make it pretty strong to make it obvious that this is what it does. And I just used this curves and adjusted the curves to make it contrast a little bit more. So you can see that there. So that's what I'm talking about in here, that noise, adding that extra level of detail. The higher your octaves, the more detail you have. Your noise strength can be controlled here, so that's how visible and noticeable it is. When I ran that simulation, I wanted it to be really, really seen well for the example, so I actually increased this to 5 for that example and that other one. You can adjust the noise scale. So similar to how you can use a noise in a texture and adjust the scale of the noise in a texture, you can adjust the scale of the noise being applied to the smoke. So you can make it smaller, you can make it bigger, you can make it 560%. So you can go above 100% if you want to. Animation speed. So similar to how you have max on noise for textures and things like that, you can also use an animation speed for the noise for the density. So this can be in here. Now, there's some really important things to recognize, because if I were to just click Upres Scene or Upres Active Cache, it's not actually going to work because we have some things we need to do in order to have this work. So I want to go over those right now. If we go back into our object, I'm going to turn off these for right now because I want to talk about velocity. So I'm going to start this at the beginning. I'm going to turn off our cache, and I'll turn back on our emitter to show this example. So we're no longer viewing the cache. I'm going to only turn on the velocity for right now, just to preview it. You'll need to have your velocity turned on to on export. But I want to show you something with it just set to on, because you get this nice preview of the vectors, and these lines and their colors, they're actually all representing the direction and the velocity of the simulation. All these little lines are showing what direction the movement's going for the simulation. If you select mask velocity, you'll see that it follows much closer to the form of the simulation. Rather than when I had mask velocity turned off. So you can use that in order to save data, but if you are going to use the upres option, you need to have mask velocity turned off in order for it to work correct. So that's one thing you need to know. You need to have mask velocity turned off, and you can only use the upres tool if you have the velocity turned on to on export. So that is important to know. Something else to know is that you need this dual rest grid option. Right now it's grayed out, and the reason why it's grayed out is because our Pyro output is referencing a Pyro scene, which you can see in here, and it's referencing the default simulation scene. Now what that's referring to is what you can see in your project settings. It also lets you preview it in here. So you can see your voxel size and everything in here. If I hit Control D, you'll also see it when we open up the project settings. That'd be Command D for people working on Macs out there. And if you go over to your simulation tab and over to Pyro, you'll see once again your voxel size and these settings in here. This is what your Pyro output is using in order to do calculations, the information in here. These are your settings for your scene. What we want to look at in here is this rest grid option. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. In order to be able to see that option in the output, we need to check this on right here. So what is the rest grid? It relates to the velocity. So for your rest grid, the rest grid reset cycle is how often it resets and recalculates the rest grid. The rest grid time scale is how fast or slow the simulation is for the rest grid. Basically, what the rest grid is it is a vector structure, and this is needed in order to do the upres option. So that's where that comes in helpful. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of how that works. This is something very nerdy, and I don't think you need to understand it fully in order to be able to do this. You just need to know that if you want to up-res your simulation and have that noise applied to it, you will need this rest grid. You will need to have it turned on, and it does use the velocity, so you'll need to have that turned on for your cache as well. That's the most important thing to understand. You don't need to understand this in greater depth than that. So hopefully that's a little bit comforting, because I know that this is complicated. So I noticed that since I updated my computer, it was no longer showing my cursor the way that I saw it on my screen while I was recording. So I went ahead and updated the tracking settings on my cursor, and now it looks a little bit better. So I hope that helps all of you out. In here, within our Pyro output, where it says dual rest grid, I have that on now. We have that turned on in our scene settings. So we have all of that set up. We have our velocity turned on, and we have the mask velocity turned off. So that's really important. And now with all of that, we can re-export this out as a cache. So I'll need to delete this one. And now this is a good opportunity to show you how to delete a cache. So you just select in here, and when you click delete selected caches, it'll delete the old version. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll say, do you really want to delete the VDB files on disk? And I'll say, yes, I do. And now with that all done, I can go ahead and cache this out again, but this version will be set up so that it's appropriate for the upres, and I can show you how to do that as well. So I'll go ahead and hit cache scene, and I'll choose a location to save this. I'm going to go ahead and save this right over here. I'll select as the folder, and it'll start updating in your viewport as it is caching so that you can see it. And that'll help you know if it's caching out correctly. And you can see the percentage finished here. So it's almost done. It's not too complicated of a simulation, so it should go pretty quick. My voxels are not super small, so that'll also help this go a little bit faster. Now we have this here. Now in order to do the Upres Scene, all we need to do is make sure that we have this selected and that these settings are set the way we'd like them to be. And with this selected, I can go ahead and click. I also like to uncheck this enabled because I find it works better. And then I like to click Upres Active Cache. So it will upres this in particular. I'm going, in this instance, to have the Upres Factor set to 2, additional octaves set to 2. The noise strength is set to 2 as well. Noise scale I increased to 150, so that's a little bit of a larger noise. And the animation speed, I'm just keeping at the default of 2.5. You can be experimental with this and try different settings and see what you like. That's what I'm using for right now. And I'm going to click this button. It'll say store VDBs at project location. You can if you want. I don't want to save on the cloud, so I'd like to save it instead to my hard drive so that it's just quicker for my computer to access. So I'm going to click no, and I'm going to choose my own location for it. I'm going to save this to here, rest grid example upres. I'll select this as the folder, and now it is caching it out. And you can already see that noise in the simulation. So that's the noise settings we had set up. And it's running really quick. So to get this fine of detail without the upres would take longer. So now this is cached out. I can preview the animation a little bit quicker now that it's fully cached. can go forwards and backwards in here. And you can see that noise structure just even here. If I click Start IPR, you can also see it render out a little bit. When I go up here to click the IPR, you can see that noise structure in here quite a bit. I think it'll be easier to see if we turn off the color channel, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And you'll see it updates. I'm going to allow this to play forward a little bit. Sometimes the VDB files can be a little bit big, and for Cinema 4D to access them, it can sometimes take a minute. I'm going to go ahead and pause this. But still overall a lot quicker than if this was done a different way without being cached. You can go ahead and see this is rendering and see that fine detail that we added in with the noise and the upres. It's a lot more detailed than if we were to switch this back to this one here. This is our original without the noise added in. This is what it looked like before without the upres or the noise, and this is the after. So it's a huge difference, and it can really add a lot to your Pyro simulations. I think that most people don't even know that option is there, but it's extremely powerful and it's great to add to your renders. Another cool thing you might want to know is that with the Pyro output, you don't actually need the Pyro emitter enabled anymore. This is enough to play the cached version. There we go. My computer's lagging a little bit. So you can see we can play that still. And you can even create duplicates of the output. So if you need, let's say you have made multiple torches that you want to have a fire animation to, you can make a duplicate of it and rotate it a bit and have multiple torches within your scene lighting up a space. And you only had to do one simulation in order to create those. So you can duplicate your Pyro outputs so that you can have more than one to preview, which is pretty cool. That is basically what I wanted to cover here for today. One more thing to mention is that if you wanted to, you could even use a field object in order to control where the noise is being applied. This is your noise falloff. You can use a field, any kind of field from here, but you can also select it from here if you'd like to control where the noise is being applied when you upres it. But I didn't think we need that for this simulation here today. I just want you to know that's an option. That covers all the settings for the upres and the noise options within the Pyro output. I really hope this helps you render out your simulations and get them looking just the way you'd like them to. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit like and subscribe. If you hit the bell, you'll be notified when the next episode comes out if you're interested in learning more about Pyro, because we're still going to stay on this topic. I want to talk more about the settings in the simulation scene and how you can work with that. I also want to talk about how you can actually turn your Pyro simulations into a mesh, which you might find interesting to be able to have it in a mesh format instead of voxels, like you see here rendering out. So if you're interested in that, I do plan on talking about that in the future. I also will go through the Pyro volume in a little bit more depth, the material. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and hope to see you here next time on Ambient 3D Animations.